So we had a first question of, was there a moment when Ari and I first realized that the natural environment was changing beyond what we could control? And my response to that, as I was thinking about it, I think I became overwhelmed with the single-use plastics as a mother, seeing that it was almost impossible to avoid the disposable nature of products. Later, we did a project for the city of Encinitas where they wanted to eliminate styrofoam food containers. And to see the outpouring of the community support for getting rid of styrofoam containers because people did not want to see the litter, the land-based litter that becomes ocean debris. And I think that's part of what we see in this community is the connection between our natural environment and the environmental degradation that we're causing. So that was really sort of the aha moment for me, was actually first as a mother and then just continuing that it's really impossible to avoid the single-use plastics. And even if you use your bread bag for picking up your dog poop, it's still, there's more bread coming than the plastic that's getting pushed to us to pick up the dog poop, for example. I'll turn that over to Ari.
So I've always been a plant person. I grew up in a florist family in New Jersey. I'm a fourth generation florist. And I knew plants, and I was comfortable around plants. And I actually grew up in the woods. Our house was in the woods, surrounded by tulip poplars primarily. And it wasn't until a little bit later in life, really after I graduated college, that I really got the bug for identifying plants in nature. And when I was able to do so and started looking them up, by their scientific names, I learned that almost half of the plants that I thought of as most familiar to like the forest that I grew up in were invasive species. In that part of New Jersey, multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, which was one of the vines I loved swinging on as a kid. Even the native grapevines were, majorly hybridized in ways that would not have happened without human movement of grape species around the eastern United States. And so to me, that was just this shocking, I thought that was nature, right? And I guess in my mind, I thought nature was somehow untouched. And now, because I could I could recognize the plants, I could name them, I could make a list of a few dozen or 100 species that were there, and I could see the percentage of them that were from Asia or other continents and weren't really the original parts of that ecosystem, and then begin to learn about why and how that was changing things. That was just stunning and shocking to me, and was my introduction to how much things have really changed because of human intervention.
Particularly right now, that may be a good idea to build partnerships at the local level, both because of the economics of that, but also because of extended power. And what's interesting, this is a botanical garden that is a place. And you work all over the place. And the days of botanical gardens are to be disconnected. The region around it is pretty much over. I'm wondering, are you taking the next step? What are you going to do that's different from what has been done?
That's a great question. I've written a lot about that topic. We're really interested within the Botanic Garden community of what a 21st century Botanic Garden looks like. And I think the most succinct way of defining the 21st century Botanic Garden relative to what we've had previously is that the 21st century Botanic Garden is very specifically aware of the community issues of the community in which it finds itself, the communities that are around it, and is leveraging the superpower that Botanic Gardens have, which is, amazing plant collections and the ability to actually steward and, help thrive thousands of species of plants towards those goals. So if the local community has food security issues, how do the plants in the Botanic Garden, how does the knowledge that the Botanic Garden possesses in terms of growing plants, how is that leverageable for that particular issue? If the problem is nature deficit disorder, the kids in the region are not connected to nature, we are a perfect place to improve whatever you want to call it. Nature literacy, combat plant blindness, all these great terminologies that are coming up. If it's civic engagement that's needed, plants have a solution. I'm a student of garden history. The Medicean gardens, the 12 gardens built by the Medici family in and around Florence, Italy, they were built for civic purposes by the aristocrats at the time to enhance civic goals, business, trade, all kinds of different things that we don't think of as within the purview of nonprofit place-based organizations, but in fact are and historically were, and there are new ways in which we can do that. So I think the garden has a lot of opportunity. It's an amazing tool, and it's limited only by how creative and aware and astute we are of the nature of the problems in our communities that should be addressed and that can be addressed uniquely through Botanic Garden resources.
I don't know what to say after that. No, I mean, imagine, for example, we're doing a project right now, Mary Matava is working with us on it, where we're evaluating the soil samples, soil amendments that are coming from different sources, feedstocks being the food that we're trying to divert from going to the landfill. So we have a sample from a commercial composting facility, we have a sample from a wastewater treatment center, and we have a sample from the anaerobic digesters, digestate. We're looking at how much plastic is in that. We talked to Ari about it, and you can imagine the connection that we might have. This is these are single samples. It's almost a prototype study at this point, but you can imagine that we could do a more in-depth, scientifically rigorous study in partnership, because right now there's legislation at the state level that says all organic material, and particularly food waste, has to be kept from going to the landfill. Well, what is the result of that right now? We are putting so much material toward these processing facilities and operations. A lot of plastic is ending up in them. How much plastic are we then going to end up putting on our fields and in our gardens? So this is the type of thing that we're looking at, and a connection with the Botanic Gardens. It'll just amplify our voice. And they have a science labs, which you don't see when you come here, but under Ari's purview and under the Botanic Garden here, these are the types of things that we might look at together. That addresses some of the ways we might work together. I have other ideas too, which I'll share later on.
So often in terms of climate change and biodiversity collapse and the other environmental issues we face, we're given two choices. We're either supposed to wait for government to pass laws to do something, or we're supposed to do it ourselves through what we throw into the trash and all that, and other individualized solutions. Both of those are incredibly important, but what is there other than that? What is there between the individual and the government that can happen?
I'll take that one first. I think the education and outreach is extremely important, and that's very much what Solana Center's foundation is. We've been around for 40 years. We've started as the first curbside recyclers, and all the way along we've been about educating people, whether it's about recycling. Right now we have a very heavy emphasis on educating businesses about capturing edible food and making sure that doesn't end up in the landfill, but also making sure that it goes to people in need. And so education is key. I like to think of 3 areas that need to come together, and that is investment, legislation, and then the education and outreach. And Ari's been very successful, I think, in a number of those areas, bringing them together. I could talk to him for hours about, how legislation or investment impact the work that we do.
Gosh, I love this topic, and I want to highlight that part of why we're doing this is not only are Solana Center and the Botanic Garden considering partnering, we're actually looking at an even longer-term strategy where maybe we meld, where we join as an organization, and not just to achieve kind of economy of scale or share overhead costs or any of these kind of technical matters, but because we think that the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of experience that our institutions have gained separately can be so synergistic that the whole really can be greater than the sum of its parts. This question is really interesting to me because I'm not going to get political now, but clearly, maybe in 5 minutes.
Give her a
but
few
not
drinks.
And I'm speaking in Congress on Tuesday next week, which will be interesting. It was booked during the previous administration. If we're entering a time period where this covenant, between people who want to improve the world and the environment depends heavily on shepherding processes through some sort of a legislative goal, if that period is coming to an end and we're having to learn how to make durable change as groups of human beings, maybe outside of the prescribed governmental process, it feels to me like we might look for inspiration to the activities of humans over time that actually have been recalcitrant to government control, but still been organized. This makes me think about, there is a great political scientist at Cornell named Ron Herring, who primarily studied agricultural political organization, especially in India and in South America in the early part of the 20th century. And in one of his great papers, he refers to farmers and horticulturists as the most organized and decentralized group of people on the planet. And he does this in a paper that's about something called stealth seeds, which are essentially seeds that are being moved around by farmers that have intellectual property on them, but the intellectual property stuff is not working, right? The companies who develop them are not getting their royalties because the farmers are like, screw you, we know how to grow these things, and you try to track them through farmer to farmer networks in Argentina. And come and get us if you feel like it, right? And so there are these examples, and especially in the plant world, and where plants are useful, for how people organize across great distances, and to great impact. Ron and some of his colleagues found that the movement of these stealth seeds around Argentina increased yields by 30–40%. Right? I mean, and that's a huge, in land saved, right? So if you can increase, productivity on the existing farmland by 30–40%, that changes how much less land you invade in the Amazon or other places where the agricultural expansion is happening. And so, this is interesting, right? The plant people, the waste people, the thinkers recognizing we're in a moment of very severe political change, but that we cannot give up on having real world change happen, creates synergistic opportunities and makes me feel like these are the right conversations to have, and that together we can find the right examples from history that are going to point the way forward in this new era.
I think partnerships like yours and others, there's something beyond policy. These charismatic ideas that people can get engaged in, and they create and say, who did that? Somehow I think that more than ever that's the key.
And I would say that underlying that is the attitude and attitude change that needs to take place for behaviors, for group behavior. And then going back to what Ari was saying, you don't need legislative change. You need an appetite for the change that you want to see take place. And that can be, go ahead.
Well, part of it, the thing that excites me, all of this excites me, but one of the things that excites me the most is that it's an opportunity for us to get to know our neighbors and our community better. Doug's book is fantastic. If anyone hasn't read it, Doug Talmy is a professor at the University of Delaware. Go Fighting Blue Hens. And how many of you knew that, Fighting Blue Hens? Doug and I wrote a paper together years ago. Yeah, Doug's great. But he came to this, he had an idea before he had the research. And Doug's a bird guy. He loves birds. He's an entomologist by training, but he's really a bird person. And and he found the love of plants because his entomological research was showing that different plant species supported a different assemblage and volume of primarily caterpillars, and that was the primary food and determinant of health for the birds that he loved. So, I give this talk to garden groups called Plants Are Almost Everything. right? And it's literal, right? 80% of the terrestrial biomass of Earth are plants, right? All the living stuff is almost all plants. And plants take the energy of the sun, and they turn it into chemical energy for the rest of the biosphere to move on. And so whatever you're interested in, I bet you we can figure out how plants are responsible for delivering you that good. Doug's genius was finding that for bird people, here's what you do with plants. And he's now been producing with his research group these lists of the native plants, primarily in the mid-Atlantic where he is, that are the best ones for the most caterpillar species in the most seasons, so that the birds are happy. And so we talk to each other, and if we talk to each other and we find out, what are you interested in? Is it birds? Is it fish? Is it beauty? Is it picnicking, right? All the things people are interested in are enabled by nature, right? And so our job then becomes, how do we show people that their actions are gonna do what they wanna do? Bring more birds to their backyard, create more shady spots for the picnic and the family time. And how do we leverage nature in order to do that? There's a really interesting opportunity, and people right now, for whatever their reasons are very unhappy with government. They're very unhappy with these large, prescribed bureaucratic efforts to make things happen. And we might be able to present them with a more organic way of doing it, literally and figuratively, but only if we understand what they really want and can relate to them.
And I think the key to that also is not projecting too far out. So we're talking about climate change, that really concerns me. But at the same time, when Leah, who's in the audience, goes out to a business and is working with them to make sure that they divert the food waste from going to the landfill, the trigger is not to talk to them about, oh, it's the best thing that you can do if, greenhouse gases are emitted when it goes in the landfill. No, start talking to them about tax incentives, talk about the people who are going to, the edible food that's going to go to people in need. There have been some really tremendous work that our team led by Leah and Malika have done in terms of now a dairy farm is donating 250,000 pounds of dairy products every year that was otherwise going to animal feed. And it is one of the products that's most needed by the, and so I'm getting off track here, but it's most needed by the food recovery agencies. My point here being that I think when you're reaching somebody who's not necessarily thinking the long term, find out what their triggers are.
But I realized once I do connections, started learning the connections, between the plants and the animals, what were they going to do? Oh, if there's that plant, then there's probably going to be a raccoon nearby, or some other animal, lizard that I mentioned. So it's a way to break down plant lines. I wonder if there's people that are animal plant. I don't think there are.
Well, plant blindness is a term coined by former LSU professor named James Wandersee. And it's a little bit of a controversial term in our world because it's a bit negative, right? You don't want to call somebody blind, but it's accurate. And there are evolutionary ecologists and evolutionary psychologists that are actually looking at this and trying to understand, is there a biological basis for plant blindness? Why don't people see plants? And there is a theory out there, it's hard to test, but it's kind of a fun one, that, plants don't jump out and eat you. So, generally speaking, sci-fi movies from the 1930s about big giant edible, Venus flytraps notwithstanding, humans, we see a sea of green, like here and out there, and we see that as soothing, right? There's not really danger there. Whereas, something that looks like a saber-toothed tiger, or really almost any other animal, and let's also not forget that the most deadly animals are the small ones. The mosquito is the most deadly animal, kills most people every year by vectoring diseases like malaria. So we're not programmed to see danger in plants, and since there's no danger there, we're kind of like, and this is really interesting. We have some really wonderful partnerships with indigenous partners here in San Diego County, here at San Diego Botanic Garden. We're very fortunate. And Richard Bugby passed away last year, but he was an elder, a medicinal plant healer at the Mool Band of Kumeyaay Nation, although he was born in Lusania. And I asked him a couple of ecological questions once about terms that we use in modern ecology, like invasion and things like that, and just said, do they have meaning within, the indigenous framework that he utilizes? And he answered the question, but then he, as he always did, took it to something much more interesting than what I asked him. And he said, did you know that in the Kumeyaay language, we only name the plants that have uses? The rest of them we call kind of green thing. And that was a big statement. You need to name it, but also inherent is the value. And so in their language, the plant is named, and it's named with its value, right? And so a name might mean this is used for X medicinal purpose. This is used for as a famine food. This is used for building, construction, art. And, I love science. I'm a scientist. But I can tell you that Latin names don't connect with anybody. We need, I think, this whole question about naming things in a way that helps a human being understand what it is, and plant blindness, not understanding that the plants out there have meaning or value, are very, very connected. I don't think it's marketing. I think it's actually going back to the way things used to be. If you look at old plant names, in many cultures, they really do refer to what that plant was used for. Horse chestnuts, by the way, were used by the ancient Romans to treat horse cough, right? It was a veterinary medicine. So, and that's an old Latin name because people castano. And I think a lot of the answers are out there in nature and they're in the past. And, we've just disconnected from these things, and finding the way to reconnect is really exciting.
So I'm increasingly interested in how we use our senses to notice nature. Do we do that? How do we do that? And I wondered if you've given much thought.
How we use our senses?
How do you notice nature?
How do we know what's nature?
Notice.
Notice nature. Oh, God. I used to teach New York City's kids about nature. I would take them into natural places, often farm fields. And I think the thing that most made an impression on me was we were at a fig tree, right at the peak of the ripeness of those figs. And I knew the field that it was in, and I knew that landowner did not do anything to those figs. I mean, they were just figs growing with no fertilizer, pesticides, anything, right? They were touched by rain and wind and dust. And I said to everybody, well, these figs are in great season. Let's eat a few. And, revulsion. Oh, you can't eat that, Why not? It's out here in nature. They said it. And I said, where is the fig supposed to come from? The supermarket. Ideally, under fluorescent light and wrapped in plastic. And so, their senses were engaged. They understood that we were out in nature, right? They knew all that, but they were scared of it. And, I think that, the kind of work that we all do and that we talk about doing is about bringing people, and especially young people, into natural environments to realize that it's okay with knowledge. The converse of this is that nature is scary and deadly, right? I like to, I love J.R. Tolkien, and all the wild woods in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, those are the most dangerous places where you don't want to go, right? And that's accurate through most of history. You do not want to go into those woods. That's where, bad things are going to happen to you unless you really know what you're doing. So I think the other side of this is nature's not some sort of benevolent, goddess that just bestows wonderful things upon you, nor is it this really scary, titan. It's a place where knowledge allows you to be protected and to benefit. And so if we're not starting from knowledge at a very early age, and reasonable comfort that's informed by reality, not ideology, young people don't have a chance to grow into older people who understand what the bounty of nature can be. It's something that needs to be worked towards and investigated.
And a sobering thought is how that's changing over time. I've been in this area for 30 years, swimming in the ocean. I used to see Garibaldi and large rays and sharks, and those are few and far between. The beaches have far fewer shells, I think that's important to understand that that's really at the nexus of what our organizations are talking about. We want the future generations to be able to have that nature for so many different reasons, for the wonderment it brings, but also for any number of things in terms of agricultural reasons and, for our sanity, so we're not living in a concrete jungle and just drinking out of plastic and disposing of it and it ending up on our beaches. And so I think just bringing it back to the practical is very much why we want to work together.
I would hope also you would go beyond the practical. I would also hope that you would go beyond the practical.
I would say tackling the practical with the understanding that the long-term purpose is true change, to start turning the ship.
And we talked a little earlier, just when we were getting ready to talk about the concept of nature and the idea that maybe nature is always an appeal to the spiritual or theological. That in fact when we talk about nature, especially by being inspired by it, we're really making a spiritual values judgment and inviting other people to join us in that judgment. And so I think there's also this connection between deep meaning, and practicality and nature, which is really the only thing we all have as a common denominator. And again, I think that was very common in the past. When people were agriculturalists, you go back 100, 125 years, and the vast majority of people on the planet are all farmers, and they're intertwined with natural things every day. And it made no sense to think about nature as distinct from humanity. But today we live in a different world, and something's clearly been lost, and lost rapidly. The demographic shift is so rapid, and so organizations like ours in partnership are, I think, trying to just reconnect people to that and present the practicality and present these deep values propositions.
I get asked a lot, what are the basics for a parent who wants to connect their kids to nature? And I've come to just to think that sometimes the less that the parent knows about nature, the fewer the names of the plants, the animals that the parent knows, the better. Because when they're out there with their kid, and they see this amazing animal or an amazing plant, the kid is never going to remember necessarily the name of that plant. What the kid will remember is the look in their parents' eyes of wonder. Because they're discovering it at the same time. They'll remember that. And that's the element that is so often missing in environmental education. It's all about the pH of the water, testing, and other things. But what about the wonder? What about, in this book I call it The Light Behind the Light, what about that?
And Jennifer, who's in the audience, is amazing, got an amazing green thumb, and the wonder you see in her eyes when she's got dirt all over her hands and a big smile on her face, it's infectious. I know she says that just putting your hands in the soil does wonders. And we've run some programs, it's been a while, but working with incarcerated youth or at-risk youth, and knowing that nature makes a tremendous difference in that help.
We're excited about that kind of partnership. We really believe that. Every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning, we have a program for all of our visitors and members called Saplings, and it's always a hands-on exercise for kids to get their hands in the dirt, get them planting. We usually combine it with maybe an art or music or a storytelling type element as well. And we just think that's fundamental. That just has to be happening here almost all the time. It is amazing, what can happen with just that proximity. And
I would say that level of appreciation at a young age is so key for a lifelong caring for our environment. And I'm worried about time. So I'd like to turn it to anyone in the audience, if you have questions for any of the three of us.
I was going to say, what have either of you or both of you learned about pitfalls of collaborating with other organizations when I can think of so many small nonprofits that share very similar passions and struggling for resources? What does and doesn't work?
Good question. I can turn it over to Ari, but I'll say we're in the early stages. What's interesting to me about this collaboration is I would say that we have some minor overlaps, but really we're adjacent. And so there's not stepping on toes issues. It's not who's going to teach the composting course. It's that's something we've been doing for a long time. Providing this beautiful space as an opportunity for us to teach the courses is a great collaboration in my view. And I love Ari's big picture thinking, and you know, we get an opportunity to brainstorm and think about some of these things that I believe will have a huge impact for both organizations. One thing that's very important to me is that the mission of Solana Center, that we remain true to that mission. That will not change. We focus on the environment. I envision a future where we have our oceans and our landfills free of the resources that today are ending up in those landfills and oceans that we're discarding. And that will be true to us whether we are collaborating with a larger place-based organization or not. And that's something that we, you know, in these discussions, I've made it very clear that that's something we won't compromise on.
We have time for one more. You had your hand up for quite a while.
I'd love to hear from Ari about the pitfalls.
I'll answer very quickly. My experience, the thing that destroys collaborations is an attitude of competition. You know, you have to want to work together and be synergistic. And if there's territoriality or a perceived competition for resources, it doesn't work well. And I think, you know, yeah, there's not enough resources out there, but there's enough need. And so we should be focusing on the depth of the need and recognize that there's no possibility for competition because there's an endless well of need that organizations like ours can attack. If we focus on resource competition, it tends to go better.
We will be available and milling about, so please feel free to come up and chat if you have more questions. Thank you so much for